Thomas Whitaker never imagined his life would end this way, alone, unnoticed, and in a hospital bed. He was 67 years old, a retired mechanical engineer who had once worked on precision systems for aerospace firms outside Colorado Springs. He was known for his logic, his neat notebooks full of calculations, and the quiet, methodical way he approached life. But for the past 5 years, ever since the death of his wife, Margaret, none of that had mattered. Thomas had become a man of routines, but not the kind that brought peace. He ate the same microwave dinner every night, chicken pot pie, sometimes beef stew, sat in the same creaky armchair, and reread the same dog-eared novels. His 2 adult children lived in different states, both immersed in lives too busy for phone calls that lasted more than 5 minutes. And faith that had never been part of Thomas's equation. To him, God was something people invented to soften the blow of randomness. After all, where had God been when Margaret died in her sleep without warning? Where had God been when Thomas stood in the funeral home watching the casket lid close, feeling like a chapter of himself had sealed with it? His neighbors rarely saw him, except when he took out the trash on Monday mornings. He no longer attended the community center. Even his old engineer buddies stopped calling. It wasn't that Thomas was angry, it was deeper than that. He had simply resigned. Life in his eyes had run out of color. It was grayscale static, a dull hum in the background. And so, like a machine, slowly winding down, Thomas stopped trying. No hobbies, no travel, no prayers, just silence. Until one night in late November when everything unraveled. It started with a dull ache in his chest as he reached up to turn off the bedside lamp. At first he thought it was indigestion from the canned chili he had reluctantly opened for dinner. But then the ache sharpened, spread, crawled up his jaw, down his left arm. Within moments the pain turned crushing. He collapsed onto the floor, struggling to breathe. The cold hardwood pressed against his cheek as his vision dimmed, and all he could manage was a strangled whisper for help that no one heard. By the time the paramedics arrived, alerted by a wellness check requested by a concerned delivery driver, it was almost too late. Thomas was unconscious, his heartbeat erratic and shallow. The EMTs loaded him into the ambulance and raced through the darkened streets towards St. Luke's Medical Center. In the back of that van, amid the blinking monitors and hurried voices, Thomas flatlined for the first time. But they got him back. Barely. Rushed into emergency cardiac surgery, Thomas was surrounded by the clamor of operating room staff, the antiseptic brightness of surgical lights, and the steady urgency of machines keeping time with his failing heart. But despite the efforts of skilled hands and advanced medical technology, his body couldn't hold on. At precisely 2:17 a.m., Thomas Whitaker was declared clinically dead. No heartbeat, no brain activity, no signs of life for 14 long minutes. What happened next was not written in his medical chart. What no one in the room could see, no surgeon, no nurse, not even the attending anesthesiologist, was that Thomas didn't vanish into blackness. He didn't simply cease to be. Instead, he found himself standing at the foot of the operating table, looking at his own lifeless body. The scene before him was surreal, familiar, yet utterly foreign. He watched as the doctors moved with purpose, administering chest compressions, shouting commands. He saw the sweat beading on the forehead of the lead surgeon, the way one nurse gripped the edge of the table in silent desperation. He heard their thoughts, not just the words they spoke, but the unspoken ones, the fear, the frustration, the flicker of doubt in the face of death. He turned and looked toward the waiting room, somehow able to perceive through walls, and saw his daughter, knees trembling, pacing and murmuring, "Dad, please don't go." He felt her anguish as though it were his own. He saw his son, still on a plane, unaware of the emergency, slouched in a seat reading a tech magazine, completely oblivious to the fact that his father had just died. And yet Thomas felt more alert than ever before. His mind was sharp, his senses heightened. It was as if someone had removed a thick layer of insulation between him and the world. Everything pulsed with clarity, from the hum of the lights above to the rhythm of breath in the room. But perhaps the most jarring realization of all was this: he wasn't in pain. He wasn't afraid. He simply existed, aware, present, fully himself, but outside the shell that had once been Thomas Whitaker. In that moment, something cracked. Not in the medical sense, but in the spiritual. For the first time in his 67 years, Thomas considered the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong. Maybe life didn't end when the heart stopped beating. Maybe there was more than neurons and muscle memory, more than atoms and equations. And yet as he stood there, he felt something shift in the atmosphere. A strange sensation, like being pulled gently but irresistibly into something vast and unknown. The room around him faded like fog receding at sunrise, and darkness began to gather at the edges of his awareness. But this darkness was not the absence of light. It was something else entirely. Something he could not explain. And so began the journey of Thomas Whitaker, not just from death to life, but from logic to wonder, from emptiness to awakening. The moment Thomas felt himself pulled away from the brightness of the operating room, there was no jolt, no sensation of being ripped from his body. It was more like a gentle detachment, like exhaling after holding your breath too long. And suddenly he wasn't lying on the table anymore. He was standing upright, just a few feet away from the very body he'd lived in for 67 years. Still dressed in the hospital gown, still surrounded by the sterile urgency of an emergency surgery suite. But it was no longer him. It was just what he used to wear. Thomas blinked, or at least he thought he did. He wasn't entirely sure anymore. He had no heartbeat, no breath, no weight in his feet. Yet he could see, he could feel, he could think. In fact, everything felt more vivid than it ever had before. The lights in the OR were sharper, as if filtered through crystal. The sounds, beeping monitors, urgent commands from the surgeons carried with them not just noise, but intention, meaning, emotion. He wasn't just observing events. He was experiencing them from the inside out. He looked down at his body, pale and motionless under the surgical lights. One of the nurses was squeezing a bag valve mask, while another counted aloud as the surgeon administered chest compressions. "Come on, Mr. Whitaker," someone muttered under their breath. "Stay with us." Thomas could see the stress lining their faces, but even more surreal was the sense that he could feel their thoughts, not as words, but as energy. Anxiety, hope, fatigue, even doubt. It all pulsed in the air like heat from a furnace. He turned away from the table, unsure what he was supposed to do, if supposed to still applied to him anymore. Instinctively, his awareness drifted through the OR doors, as if barriers meant nothing now. He passed through the corridor like breath through mist, and found himself near the waiting area. It wasn't a place he had consciously intended to go. He was simply there. His daughter Melissa was seated with her head buried in her hands, her lips moving silently in prayer. That surprised him. She hadn't been to church since college, at least as far as he knew. But now she was whispering desperate words to a God Thomas had always dismissed. "Please don't take him. Please just let him come back." He reached out reflexively, but his hand passed through the arm of the chair. Still, she shivered slightly, as if she'd felt something. In another room across the building, he saw his son Jason, just landing in Denver, still oblivious. Somehow Thomas's vision and his presence wasn't limited by walls or distance. He could see Jason opening his phone, the screen lighting up with missed calls. And with it, Thomas felt his son's anxiety beginning to stir like a thundercloud forming on the horizon of his soul. These weren't hallucinations. They were realities clearer and deeper than anything Thomas had ever experienced. It was like being tuned to a different frequency, one that existed all along, but had always been drowned out by the static of everyday life. For a man who had lived decades believing in nothing beyond what could be calculated, measured, and tested, this was not just disorienting. It was humbling. He was no longer in control. Yet for the first time since Margaret had passed away, Thomas felt alive. Not in a physical sense, of course, but in something more essential. It was as though all the numbness, all the detachment that had defined his recent years had been stripped away. What remained was something raw, aware, and open. Time did not seem to function normally. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Or maybe it was the other way around. Thomas found himself drifting not aimlessly, but almost guided back toward the operating room. He stood once again near the table where his body lay. Nothing had changed. But he had. Something in him had awakened like a curtain drawn back to reveal a vast and unknown landscape. And then slowly, the scene began to dissolve. Not disappear, but melt like fog under sunlight. The walls of the room faded. The people dimmed. The hum of machines softened into silence. All that remained was a sense of motion, a pull, not physical but undeniable. Thomas felt himself being drawn not by force, but by invitation into a deeper reality, as if everything he had known up until that moment had been only the outermost layer of something far more intricate. At first he resisted. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like unfamiliarity. But the pull became stronger, the awareness more intense. And as he surrendered to it, everything around him fell away. Then came the darkness. Not the darkness of a room with the lights turned off. This was heavier, thicker, like walking through molasses in pitch black. It pressed in from every side, making movement feel slow and strange. Thomas could no longer see anything. Not his body, not the doctor's, not even his own hands. And stranger still, he couldn't remember his name, or where he had been, or even who he was. It was as if his mind had been wiped clean, leaving behind only raw sensation. There was no sound, no light, no direction. It was the most alone he had ever felt. And yet deep inside, a flicker of awareness remained. Just enough to wonder, is this death? Is this all there is? That question echoed without echo, because in this place even sound seemed to dissolve. And yet Thomas remained conscious, aware. He couldn't reason his way out. He couldn't pray, he had never learned how. All he could do was be, in a void that seemed to stretch forever. This was the earthworm's eye view, a primitive awareness stripped of ego, memory, identity. Not hell, but not peace either. A waiting room of souls not yet awakened, where the self waits to remember who it is. Thomas didn't know it yet, but this darkness was not punishment. It was the beginning. A pause, a silence before the symphony. And somewhere just barely on the edges of the nothingness, a light began to stir. Thomas had always believed in absolutes. Thermodynamics, gravity, the speed of sound, the rigidity of steel. In his world as an engineer, everything had a formula, a structure, an expected behavior. But now, in this strange and haunting existence beyond the veil of death, none of those constants applied. Logic had evaporated. Time, space, and even memory bent like heat waves on a summer road. And worst of all, his sense of self began to unravel. At first, there had been a clarity, a hyper-awareness as he stood outside his body watching doctors battle to revive him, hearing thoughts and emotions like radio waves from across rooms. But that moment had passed. The sterile white of the operating room had melted away, replaced by something far more difficult to define. Darkness, not merely the absence of light, but a presence in itself, had swallowed everything. He could no longer see. No colors, no forms. He had no body, no breath. Even his mind felt unanchored, drifting in something so thick, so utterly dense it reminded him of oil or wet concrete. Not wet enough to swim through, not solid enough to stand on. Just an overwhelming presence of weight and silence pressing against what remained of him. It was in this thick blackness that Thomas experienced something no science book had ever prepared him for: the slow erasure of identity. He could no longer remember his last name, then his first. Then the memory of Margaret, his late wife, began to flicker like a dying bulb, until even her face became a blur. Details he had clung to his entire life, the names of his children, his home address, the feel of his favorite leather chair, all slipped through his grasp like grains of sand. Even the concept of Thomas was fading. What was left was not a person but a presence, observing, waiting, enduring. And for the first time in his existence on Earth or beyond, Thomas felt what it truly meant to be alone. This place wasn't fire and brimstone. It wasn't hell, not in the way religious people often described. But it was torment, all the same. Not physical pain, but existential emptiness. There was no up or down, no forward or backward, just an endless now. And within that now was a silence so profound, so utterly void of meaning, that it gnawed at what remained of his awareness. Time ceased to be measured in seconds or hours, it was measured in feeling. The kind of oppressive silence that made seconds feel like centuries. He began to wonder if this was all there was. If this suffocating blackness was the truth behind all the world's stories, no heaven, no judgment, just eternal drifting. A cosmic mistake. A divine shrug. The black ink at the end of the final chapter. But just as that thought threatened to cement itself in whatever was left of his consciousness, something stirred deep inside him. Not a memory, not a voice, but a yearning, a flicker of longing that pierced the haze like the softest breeze in a sealed tomb. Not a scream for rescue, he didn't remember how to scream, but a whisper, a pulse of ache that trembled through the silence. That ache was the first sign of life he'd felt since entering the void. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, that ache drew in his attention to a shift. A subtle change in the darkness. At first he thought it was his imagination, but it grew. It wasn't brighter but less dark. A thinning, perhaps. A softness like the edge of night before the dawn. And then, like a tide pulling back from the shore, Thomas began to feel himself again, not in body but in essence. He remembered his wife's laughter. The feel of his son's hand in his during a 4th of July fireworks show. The quiet joy of Sunday mornings with coffee and the paper, the scent of pine outside his cabin in the Rockies. These weren't just memories. They were anchors reassembling the puzzle of who he had once been. As the darkness began to retreat slowly, stubbornly, Thomas sensed that what he had just passed through wasn't meant to punish him. It was meant to strip him of assumptions, of pride, of labels, of the intellectual armor he had worn his entire life. What remained now was something raw, tender, open. The best way Thomas could later describe it was this. It was like being inside the mind of an earthworm's eye view, as he would later call it. A crude form of consciousness without clarity. a form of awareness that could sense but not understand. And in that state he realized just how blind he had been, even when his physical eyes had functioned perfectly. For all his achievements, degrees, and accolades, he had never seen what mattered. Not really. And then, as if in response to that surrender, something happened. From the distance, or maybe from within, a soft vibration began. It wasn't sound. It was more like music without instruments, a resonance that bypassed the ears and went straight to the soul. Gentle, loving, familiar in a way that made him want to weep, though he had no eyes to shed tears. And then light. Not a blinding flash, not a spotlight from the sky, but a swirling golden glow moving with purpose, slowly approaching. It shimmered like sunlight on rippling water. And with it came peace. Not comfort, not ease, but peace. The kind that made all the terror and confusion of the previous moments melt like frost in spring. Thomas felt warmth not on skin, but in essence. He didn't see a figure, but he felt a presence inside the light. It was as if the light itself knew him. Not just his name, not just his resume, but every layer, every silent disappointment, every buried hope, every unspoken prayer he never admitted to praying. It knew the boy who used to climb trees in Indiana. The teenager who'd been too shy to ask Margaret to dance. The man who had quietly begged, "Don't let her die in that cold hospital hallway 5 years ago." And yet it did not judge. It embraced. Not with arms, but with acceptance. Unconditional, undeniable, unexplainable. Thomas didn't speak. He couldn't. But he didn't need to. Because in that moment the light communicated something that would stay with him for the rest of his days. You are loved not because of what you did or didn't do. You are loved because you exist. It was the first truth he had ever known that didn't need to be proven. And as the darkness fully lifted, Thomas realized he was no longer drifting. He was arriving. There was no way to measure how long Thomas had floated in the light. Time had ceased to tick like a clock. It breathed now gently, infinitely, each moment an entire lifetime, yet gone in the blink of awareness. After the dense, paralyzing darkness of the void, the arrival of light felt like a second birth. But unlike the first, this one came not with pain or tears, but with recognition, as if his soul had known this place all along, but had spent a lifetime forgetting it. The light wasn't just illumination. It had presence, personality, intelligence, and most profoundly, it had love. Not a love earned or measured, not one that could be taken away or increased based on behavior. It was a constant like gravity or breath, but deeper. It didn't simply look at Thomas. It looked through him as though every hidden part of his being had always been known. He didn't see a face. No robes, no wings, no throne. What approached him wasn't a person in the traditional sense, but a radiance that felt more personal, more familiar than any embrace he had ever received on earth. And within that radiance was music, not with lyrics or melody, but with resonance that moved through him like wind through trees. The notes weren't external. They stirred in his core, tuning something long forgotten, the frequency of home. For the first time in years, Thomas wept. Not with his eyes, they no longer existed, but with the deepest part of himself. He didn't cry from fear. He cried because he realized how starved he had been for this love. How long he had walked the earth without knowing he was never unloved, never truly alone. Even when he had cursed the silence after Margaret's death. Even when he had questioned the point of living. Even when he sat in the dark microwave dinner untouched, staring at the flicker of his old lamp. He had been seen the whole time. He bow. The light moved closer, not with steps, but with purpose, wrapping around him like the gentlest of currents. There was no need for speech, and yet a message formed within him, clear, firm, unmistakable. You are known, you are loved, and you were never forgotten. In an instant, Thomas's mind was flooded with every time he had thought otherwise. The quiet despair, the years of apathy, the refusal to believe in anything he couldn't measure. But the light didn't recoil from those things. It welcomed them. It acknowledged them. And then, like a mother pulling her child into her arms, it loved through them. There was no shame here, only truth. And that truth was mercy. The scene around him began to shift, not in a jarring cinematic way, but more like water finding its natural level. Where once there was only radiance now, Thomas found himself in what felt like a vast and open space. Not a room, not a landscape, but something that held him much like the womb holds a child. It was infinite and close at the same time. And though the light remained, it dimmed just enough for him to notice something approaching within it. A form, gentle, familiar. It wasn't a stranger. Not exactly. She was a woman, young, luminous, with eyes that seemed carved from starlight. She smiled as she came near, and with that smile came a wave of memory Thomas hadn't known he possessed. He knew her, but not from this life. She didn't speak, but her words filled the space between them. I've waited for this moment for a long time. And then, like puzzle pieces snapping into place, it came to him. Eleanor. The name hit him like a breeze off a lake. Eleanor. The sister he had never met. The baby girl who had died in the womb 6 years before he was born. A tragedy his mother had mentioned once quietly with a distant gaze, as if speaking of a dream, long faded. Thomas had never dwelled on it. But now here she was, more real than any face he had seen in the mirror. She reached out not with hands but with essence, and he felt her. Not just her presence, but her joy. As if her entire existence had been leading to this reunion. Eleanor radiated gentleness, wisdom, and the kind of unconditional affection that couldn't be fabricated or faked. She didn't scold him for disbelief. She didn't bring up the years he had wasted. She simply loved him, and in doing so, healed something deep inside him. Thomas began to understand something. The light wasn't only a place. It was a being, the very source of life. The one he had always dismissed. The one he had secretly whispered to on the night Margaret died, even though he hadn't believed anyone was listening. And now here he was, not angry, not distant, but near, closer than breath. As Thomas absorbed this, Eleanor's presence shifted. She became a guide, not leading him away, but leading him inward, deeper, toward something even more profound. Suddenly his awareness expanded, and he saw laid out before him a valley vivid, lush, and impossibly beautiful. It shimmered with colors he had no name for. Rolling hills, emerald grass, a lake so clear he could see to its crystalline bottom. Trees moved with a breeze that carried no temperature, only peace. Birds flew without flapping. Light danced across the surface of the water, but there was no sun in sight. It wasn't Earth. And yet in the marrow of his soul, Thomas knew it was home. This was the Gateway Valley. Not the final destination, but the welcoming point. A place between realms, where the soul rested, where questions faded, where healing began. He stood on the edge of something vast and holy, and Eleanor stood beside him. Thomas turned to her, moved by the surreal majesty of it all, and before he could speak, she gently answered the thought forming in his mind. No sickness, no death, no fear here. Just truth, just love. And in that moment, Thomas felt lighter than he had ever felt before. All the years of doubt, cynicism, sorrow, regret, they weren't erased. They were redeemed. He had not been cast aside. He had been gently, patiently waited for. Then from the far side of the valley came a sound, a soft tolling like a distant bell carried on wind. It wasn't a warning. It was a call. And Thomas knew this was not the end of the journey. Eleanor turned to him, her presence as steady as stone and as warm as sunlight, and said without words, "There's still more to see, more to remember, more to understand." Thomas nodded, not with flesh, but with something deeper. And as he followed her into the valley of light, his heart, his true heart, began to awaken to a reality more beautiful than logic had ever allowed. He had arrived at the threshold of eternity. And the light wasn't finished with him yet. The valley stretched before him like a dream that refused to fade. If the darkness had stripped Thomas down to the core of his soul, this place, this breathtaking gateway, was where that soul began to bloom again. Every step he took was both weightless and purposeful, as if the land itself welcomed him, invited him to remember something ancient and true. And yet he knew this wasn't the final destination. This wasn't heaven proper. It was a threshold, a sacred prelude to something even more immense. They called it the Gateway Valley for a reason. Thomas stood beside Eleanor, his sister, who had died before she was ever born into the world. And yet here she was, realer than memory, a presence of peace and warmth that reminded him of spring mornings in Indiana, back when life was simple and the world still felt like magic. She had become his guide in this new realm, not in the way an older sibling leads a younger, but like someone who had seen the end from the beginning and still chose to walk beside you, step by step. The landscape shimmered not in a surreal, cartoonish way, but with a softness that felt holy. Trees moved without wind, leaves rustling with a music all their own. Flowers of impossible color turned as he passed, as if acknowledging his presence. A brook trickled in the distance, its waters laughing like children at play. Everything in this place knew him somehow. Not as the stoic man who had lost his faith, but as the child he once was, the husband he had tried to be, the broken soul who had whispered into the void when Margaret died. This place held his story, but without judgment, only understanding. And then, as he followed Eleanor deeper into the valley, he saw her. She stood near the edge of the lake, a woman cloaked in white, radiating a presence that brought stillness to everything around her. Her back was turned, but her posture carried the quiet grace of someone who had always known he would come. She didn't move until he approached. And then, ever so slowly, she turned. Thomas stopped in his tracks. Her face was unfamiliar, yet he felt as though he had known her his entire life. She had a timeless beauty, not the kind that draws crowds, but the kind that makes the world pause. Her eyes, the color of soft earth and sky, after rain, met his with a gaze that did not demand or question, it welcomed. And then she smiled. In that moment, something in Thomas's chest broke wide open. He didn't know why. He didn't know who she was. But the smile undid him. It was the kind of smile you wait your entire life to see, one that says, "I've been waiting. I remember you. I love you still." He took a step forward, overwhelmed by emotion, and before he could ask who she was, the words formed within him, unspoken, but understood. "I am part of the light that brought you here. But I came in a form your soul would recognize, a form it had always longed for." Tears came not because he was sad, but because he was finally seen. Seen in a way that no human eye had ever truly seen him. His entire life, every decision, mistake, joy, failure, loss, and longing lay exposed. But not in humiliation, in honesty. There was no shame here, just truth and compassion. The woman in white stepped forward and extended her hand. Thomas took it, surprised that something so weightless could feel so solid. The moment they touched, a new sensation enveloped him, one that would become the defining experience of his near-death journey, the life review. It didn't come as a screen or a slideshow. It wasn't like watching a movie of his life. No, this was deeper. He relived his life through the eyes and emotions of others. Every moment where he had caused pain, he felt the pain of the one he hurt. Every act of kindness, no matter how small, he felt the joy it brought to others. When he helped a stranger change a flat tire on a rainy evening, he felt the relief and gratitude of the man who had just lost his job and thought no one cared. When he ignored a phone call from his daughter because he wasn't in the mood to talk, he felt the sting of rejection she carried silently. He even relived his final moments in the hospital, but not from his own viewpoint. He saw through the eyes of the nurse, who whispered, "Come on, Thomas, stay with us," and felt her silent prayer, even though she didn't know why. She cared so much about an old man she had just met. He felt her hope and her heartbreak when he flatlined. There was no condemnation, only clarity. Eleanor stood nearby, and so did the woman in white. Neither interfered. They simply held space, allowing the experience to unfold. And when it ended, Thomas felt hollow, but in the way a shell is hollow before something beautiful is poured in. He looked up breathless from the emotional tide, and the woman in white spoke not aloud but in his spirit. "You see now how every life touches another, every word, every silence, every choice." Thomas nodded, trembling. "But I didn't know. I didn't know it mattered so much." The woman smiled again, and this time it felt like the answer to every question he had ever asked. "That's why you were given the gift of seeing it now. So that if you return, you will remember." Return. The word lingered like a fog. He turned to Eleanor. "Is that an option?" She stepped forward gently, her expression soft. "Not everyone is offered it, but you are. Not because you earned it, but because your heart is finally ready to live." Thomas felt the weight of that statement. It wasn't about being worthy. It was about being willing. Willing to live with purpose, to love intentionally, to wake up not just physically but spiritually. He looked again at the lake, its waters still reflecting not just the sky, but the light of the realm itself. A place without disease, without regret, without death. And for the first time since entering this journey, he felt torn. The valley called to him. Peace enveloped him. But something else stirred, a faint echo of life, of voices still calling his name on earth. He remembered Melissa's whispered prayers, Jason's worried texts, the nurse's tears. And then, as if summoned by his indecision, the woman in white leaned in close, her voice like wind through cedar trees. "If you stay, you will be loved. If you return, you will love." The choice was his. He stood between eternity and time, between perfect rest and unfinished calling. And in that sacred moment of pause, Thomas Whitaker, retired engineer, former atheist, grieving widower, made his decision. He turned toward the light once more and whispered, "Let me go back. But don't let me forget." Thomas didn't feel himself move. There were no footsteps, no sensation of air on skin or gravity underfoot. And yet with every passing moment he found himself drawn deeper into the heart of the light, a place that didn't exist on any map, but felt more real than anything his five senses had ever touched. It was no longer the Gateway Valley, though its peace still lingered like the memory of a song that had faded into silence. Now he stood in something beyond form, beyond color, beyond even time itself. This was the presence. There were no walls here, no sky, no earth, just a radiant field of intelligence and warmth, pure, alive, aware. And Thomas wasn't just in it. He was part of it. As though every cell of his being, every speck of consciousness was immersed in something vast and sacred, like a drop returning to an ocean it had forgotten it came from. Here he did not need to speak. He was spoken to, and not with words. The messages came as waves of knowing, deep and layered, bypassing language and striking straight to the soul. Thomas the Presence said, though not in syllables. The name was more than a label. It was a summoning, a recognition of everything he had ever been, and everything he still could become. He had imagined once upon a time that if such a moment ever happened, if he did meet God, he would fall to his knees in fear or be swallowed up by guilt. But none of that was here. There was no terror, no roaring condemnation, only truth, and with it love, love so total, it stripped away the need for defenses. He was known, completely. Down to the thoughts he'd never spoken aloud, down to the sighs in the night that only his pillow had heard. And still, he was embraced. He remembered the life review, the rawness of feeling others' pain, the humility of seeing his mistakes not from judgment but from understanding. Now, in the presence, he saw even more. He saw why the pain had happened, where it had started in others, the hidden wounds behind the sharp words, the fear behind the cold silences. Everyone who had ever hurt him, they too had been hurting, just like him. The universe wasn't built around punishment. It was built around learning, around the slow, often messy, always redemptive process of becoming love. He felt the presence speak again. Earth is not a courtroom. It is a classroom. You were never sent there to be perfect. You were sent there to remember who you are and to choose love again and again, even when it hurts. Thomas thought back to the long years after Margaret's death. The bitterness, the disbelief, the numb rituals of his days. How he had looked at the world through frosted glass, assuming the silence of God meant absence. But here in this dimension of ultimate awareness, he saw the truth. The silence hadn't been absence. It had been waiting, patient, kind, respecting his free will, never forcing, always hoping. Tears welled up again, not of sorrow but of relief. He had not been abandoned. He had simply been sleeping. And now, he was awake. Suddenly the presence shifted, not leaving but stepping aside as if to reveal something even deeper. In its place, a vast panorama unfolded before him. Not a vision in the earthly sense, but an unveiling. A cosmic tapestry. He saw souls, countless shining, moving through lifetimes, each one on a journey of awakening. Some trudging through sorrow, some blooming in grace, some raging in confusion. And yet each one deeply loved, each one held, none forgotten, none forsaken. And then he saw Earth, not as a globe on a map, but as a living, trembling, beautiful blue spirit in the midst of chaos and longing. Its people hurried hungry, searching, so many aching to be seen, to be safe, to belong. He saw wars, injustice, betrayal, greed. But he also saw kindness, done in secret. Laughter shared on back porches, meals cooked for neighbors, a child kissing an old woman's cheek. And these small acts, they lit up the darkness like stars. He heard the presence again. This is the true battle, not between nations or ideologies, but between fear and love. Every soul must choose. Thomas stood still. The weight of that revelation settled into him. He had spent most of his life afraid of loss, of vulnerability, of being wrong. And in that fear he had chosen to shut down, to hide behind logic, to protect himself from pain. But the cost had been his own aliveness. He now understood fear dims, love reveals. The presence drew near again, closer than before, and infused him with one final knowing. The point was never to live perfectly. The point was to live presently, to be fully alive, to love without reservation, and to forgive with open hands. You are not measured by the number of breaths you take, Thomas. You are measured by the number of moments you choose to breathe in grace. That sentence became a flame in his being. He had always assumed meaning was something you found like a prize at the end of effort. But now he saw meaning is not found. It is given. Every moment becomes sacred when we love through it. And then softly, like dusk melting into night, the vision faded. Not in loss, but in invitation. Eleanor appeared once more, her form bathed in the warm glow of the presence. "You've seen," she said, her voice like water and wind. "Yes," Thomas whispered, "and I don't want to forget." She stepped forward and touched his hand. "You won't." But memory fades in the physical world. So does clarity. That's why you must anchor yourself not in certainty but in wonder. Wake up every morning with this question: how can I love today? And you'll be closer to heaven than you realize. He nodded. And then he asked the question he never thought he would. "Will I see you again?" Her smile was radiant. "You never lost me." And with that she faded, not into darkness but into light. The presence returned one final time, encompassing him as if giving him a blessing. Thomas felt himself expand, stretch, shimmer until he became aware of the choice. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a demand. It was a gift. You may stay, or you may return. But know this: if you return, you carry the light with you. And the world will not understand. But it will recognize it, even if it doesn't know how. Thomas took a breath, not with lungs, but with soul. And he chose. He chose life. Not the life he had left behind, lonely and resigned, but the life he had never fully lived. A life of awareness. A life of compassion. A life that understood its source. In a blink he felt motion again. Downward, inward, toward something small and tight and warm. Like crawling into a sleeping bag after a long, cold night. And then he gasped. For air. Thomas gasped, sharp, ragged, desperate, as if he'd just surfaced after drowning in deep water. His chest arched upward from the hospital bed. Machines screamed. Monitors spiked. A nurse cried out. Somewhere nearby a crash cart clattered to the floor. And then, just as suddenly, silence fell. He lay motionless, eyes wide, mouth open, breath flooding in and out of his lungs like a windstorm had blown through his body. His limbs trembled. His vision was blurred, but his awareness was crystal clear. Not the foggy daze of waking from anesthesia. Not the disorientation of illness or confusion. No, this was something else. This was knowing. Voices flooded in, medical ones, urgent ones. He heard his name being called. "Mr. Whitaker, Thomas, can you hear me?" A blur leaned in dark blue scrubs, brown eyes, a name badge, hands on his wrist, pressure on his chest, cool oxygen against his cheeks. And then slowly, like someone turning up the volume on reality, the physical world returned. But Thomas was no longer just in this world. He had brought something back with him. The light. The truth. The memory. It pulsed within him like a second heartbeat, not made of blood, but of presence. And as he lay there dazed but conscious, he realized something with complete certainty. He was not the same man who had left. Time passed, minutes, maybe hours. The ER team buzzed around him. Someone must have called his daughter because at some point Melissa arrived. Eyes swollen, voice shaking, clutching his hand like she might lose him again. But Thomas didn't say much. Not yet. He was still somewhere between two realms, holding on to the clarity he had received beyond the veil, terrified it might slip away like a dream come morning. He spent 2 more days in cardiac ICU. They called it a miraculous recovery. The lead surgeon, a seasoned man in his 60s with tired eyes, kept rereading the chart, shaking his head. "You were gone for 14 minutes, Mr. Whitaker," he said on the second day. "We don't usually see neurological function return this clean. No damage. It's remarkable." Thomas didn't answer. How could he explain that what they called gone was actually the most alive he'd ever been? On the 3rd morning, the nurse brought him a cup of black coffee. He held it carefully, inhaling the familiar aroma. He hadn't tasted coffee in what felt like a century. But even the bitterness of that first sip felt holy. Melissa sat by his side, her hand wrapped around his. She hadn't asked many questions yet. Just stayed, watched, cried a little, smiled when he smiled. Now she looked at him gently. "Dad," she said when they brought you back. "You said something." He looked up, startled. "What did I say?" She swallowed, nervous. "You said, 'The light is still with me,' over and over again." Thomas's hand trembled slightly as he set down the cup. The room quieted. For a long moment he just breathed. Then he nodded slowly, the words forming carefully in his chest. "Because it is." And with that the floodgates opened. Not all at once, not in perfect chronology, but like a river finding its course. Thomas began to share first with Melissa, then with Jason over the phone, then with the chaplain who came to check on him. He told them about the darkness, the earthworm's eye view, the place where identity faded and the soul remembered its thirst. He spoke of the light of the music that needed no melody, the love that saw through the worst and loved anyway. He spoke of Eleanor, his sister, the one he had never met in life but now knew better than most living souls. He spoke of the valley, the life review, the presence. He spoke of the choice. By the time he was discharged, word had spread among the nurses. People peeked into his room with curiosity and awe. One whispered to another, "That's the guy who died and came back talking about God." Another said, "You should hear the way he looks at people now, like he sees something we don't." Thomas wasn't trying to be a spectacle. He just couldn't be silent. When you've seen eternity, you can't unsee it. Back at home, everything felt new. The sunlight on his kitchen table, the chirp of birds at dawn, even the creak of the old floorboards. It all shimmered with meaning. The things he had ignored for years, his neighbors' laughter, the rustle of leaves, the sound of children biking down the street, were now sacred melodies in a symphony he had once been too deaf to hear. He started journaling. At first it was just to preserve the memory, terrified that the details might fade. But over time the writing became something more, a form of communion. A way to stay connected to the light, to the presence, to the truth that had been poured into him. And then came the dreams. Not dreams in the normal sense, but visitations. Eleanor came often, sometimes to remind him, sometimes just to sit in silence beside him in his sleep. Once the presence spoke again, not through symbols, but in that same wordless voice that said, "This is not for you alone. What you've seen must be shared." Thomas hesitated. He was no preacher, no author, just a retired engineer with a long face and shaky hands. But the instruction was clear. So he began. First, he wrote a letter to his children, not about rules or religion, but about love and how it reaches even when we run from it. Then he volunteered at a senior center just to sit and listen to those who felt invisible, He helped a grieving widower fix a leaky faucet. He prayed not with fancy words but with presence, with listening, with tears, and he told his story to anyone who wanted to hear it. In church basements, in VA halls, in online forums for people who had questions they were afraid to ask in pews. He didn't claim to have all the answers, but he did carry one truth. We are not accidents. We are not forgotten. We are not alone. He would often end his talks with a simple statement delivered with eyes that had seen both the end and the beginning. The light still walks with me, and it's looking for you too. And people wept, not because they were afraid, but because they hoped it might be true. For Thomas Whitaker, the miracle wasn't that he came back from the dead. The miracle was that he finally came back to life. The miracle wasn't that Thomas had died and come back. Not really. The true miracle was that something inside him had finally awakened. It wasn't just his heart that had been restarted on that cold hospital table, it was his soul. For the first time in decades, Thomas Whitaker was fully alive, and every breath he drew now was filled with intention. But the return wasn't easy. Though his body had healed, his spirit remained tender, open, raw in a way that made ordinary life feel both brighter and more painful. There were moments when Thomas would sit in his living room, sunlight pouring through the blinds, and feel as though he could still hear the music of that other world, the hum of divine resonance like a vibration just beyond the reach of human ears. At times it would bring him to tears, not from sorrow, but from longing, a holy homesickness. The light had never left him, but the world he'd returned to was loud, distracted, and often blind to the things he now saw everywhere, and that contrast could be jarring. He found himself standing in grocery store lines, looking at strangers and feeling their inner ache. A single mother nervously counting bills at the register. A cashier with tired eyes faking a smile. A veteran staring into the distance near the pharmacy. He could feel them. Not just pity, but an understanding that came from a place far deeper. As if the light itself whispered that one's hurting, that one's forgotten, that one's afraid. And Thomas, in his quiet way, began to respond. He didn't preach. He didn't quote scripture. He didn't hand out tracts or try to convert anyone. That had never been who he was. Instead, he listened. At the diner, he lingered an extra few minutes when the waitress seemed down, asking how she was holding up. At church, he made it a point to sit next to the man who always sat alone. At the senior center, he took time to play checkers with a retired bus driver named Hank, who had stopped talking much after his wife passed. And in these little moments, unrecorded, unseen by most, Thomas knew he was walking in the purpose for which he'd returned. Not to be famous, not to start a movement, but to become the light for others. He began sharing his story more publicly, too. A retired pastor from his town invited him to speak at a small gathering one Sunday evening. Nervously, Thomas stood at the front of the fellowship hall, holding the mic in one hand and a folded page of notes in the other. The crowd was mostly older folks like himself, gray hair-lined faces, weathered hands that had held loss and laughter in equal measure. He cleared his throat. I used to think death was the end, he began, that once the heart stopped, that was it. Game over. He paused, his voice shaking slightly. But I was wrong. And I think many of us, we live like it's the end, even before we die. And then in slow, honest words, he told them about the darkness, the erasing of memory, the absolute despair of being nothing. He told them about the light, the Gateway Valley, the woman in white, about Eleanor, about the life review that had undone and rebuilt him, about the presence, the being who knew him completely and still loved him without hesitation. When he finished, there was silence. Not the awkward kind, but the kind that settles when something sacred has just passed through the room. An elderly woman in the second row wiped her eyes. A man in the back whispered, "Thank you, Lord." And Thomas sat back down, heart full, hands trembling, not because he was afraid, but because he knew something had shifted in the room. From then on, the invitations came slowly but steadily. A hospice center asked him to talk to grieving families. A local college professor invited him to share in her comparative religion class. A widowers group brought him in to speak to men who had forgotten what it meant to feel. And each time Thomas simply offered his story, never trying to convince, only to reveal. He'd always end the same way. You're not here by accident. There's more to life than what we see. And death is not the end. It's just a door. What waits on the other side is not judgment, it's love. Love that sees everything you are and says, "Come home anyway." Still, Thomas wasn't immune to the struggles of being human. There were lonely days. There were nights when the memory of Margaret's laugh made him ache in ways he couldn't put into words. There were moments he wished he could return to the valley to see Eleanor's smile, to feel the warm air of a world untouched by time or decay. But then he'd remember what the presence had told him: if you return, you will carry the light. They won't always understand, but they will recognize it. And so he lived, deliberately, gratefully, sacrificially. He mended broken relationships, calling his son Jason and asking for forgiveness for years of emotional distance. He learned how to say "I love you" more easily without feeling awkward. He let people in again, into his heart, into his home. And perhaps most importantly, he began to live with awe. Every day, Thomas took time to stand in his backyard, just before sunset, cup of coffee in hand, and let the beauty of the moment wash over him. He'd feel the breeze on his cheeks and whisper to the wind, "Thank you for letting me come back." The grass felt greener. The stars looked brighter. The sound of wind chimes on his porch carried more meaning than any symphony. And when neighbors or friends would ask how he was doing, he'd smile and say, "I'm learning how to live for the first time." One morning, a teenage girl from the local high school interviewed him for a paper she was writing about near-death experiences. She sat across from him, recorder on the table, bright-eyed and curious. "If you could sum it all up," she asked, "in one sentence, what would you want people to know?" Thomas sat quietly thinking. He looked past her toward the sun rising over the distant hills and said, "You are already loved more than you've dared to imagine, and your life, no matter how broken it feels, still holds eternal purpose." The girl stared at him, blinking back sudden tears. And in that moment, Thomas knew the light had reached her, just as it had reached him. And now, through him, it continued to reach the world. The story of Thomas Whitaker. Final conclusion. The light that remains. In the years that followed his return, Thomas Whitaker never sought the spotlight. He didn't write a book or start a YouTube channel. He wasn't interested in fame or building a platform. What he was interested in, fiercely, tenderly, was living each day as if it mattered. Because now, he knew it did. He continued walking slowly through the ordinary world with extraordinary vision, seeing people not just with his eyes but with his soul. He had been given a glimpse of something eternal, and that glimpse changed the way he loved. It changed how he listened, how he forgave, how he responded to pain. He no longer argued about religion or proof. Instead, he carried presence. He was presence, and everywhere he went, the light. He had seen the light that had loved him first was felt, even if no one could explain why. Neighbors would often say, "There's just something peaceful about that man." Young people who sat with him said, "He makes me feel safe." And in his final years he came to be known in his small town, not for what he had accomplished, but for how he made people feel when they were near him. Peaceful, valued, seen. And when the day finally came for Thomas to go home, truly home, he didn't leave with fear. He didn't cling. There was no panic in his eyes, no bitterness in his breath. He simply closed them with a faint smile, whispered, "Thank you," and let go. This time, there was no ER, no crash cart, no chaos, just quiet and light. It was waiting for him as it always had been. And as Thomas crossed that final threshold, the world didn't lose him. It gained what he left behind, a trail of light, a legacy of love, a reminder that death is not the end, and life is not just survival, but the sacred journey of waking up moment by moment to the truth that we are already loved, already known, already homebound. Final words from Thomas Whitaker, discovered in the final pages of his journal. If you are reading this, then know this much. You are not alone. You are not forgotten. You are more deeply loved than you've dared to believe. Don't wait for a near-death experience to begin living. Start now. Forgive quickly, love generously, listen deeply, and when the darkness comes, as it will for all of us, don't be afraid. The light is real. I've seen it. It knows your name. And it will never ever let you go. Thomas Whitaker, 67, retired engineer. Once an atheist, forever awakened.